Okay, so I'm gonna be honest, I was planning on making this video long before the new Stygian Onslaught game mode, but now that it's out, this isn't even a question now. Genshin Impact has officially become pay to win. So in today's video, I'll go over why. I'll talk about all the reasons for why Genshin Impact has finally become pay to win, from the MiHoYo meta to the new recent Stygian Onslaught disaster. But first, I wanted to describe the history of power creep in Genshin, so that I can give the new power creep something to compare it to. Genshin had always been hated and yet loved for a myriad of reasons, but everyone, even the haters, have always agreed that Genshin Impact was the game that suffers the least from power creep, for its free-to-play 4-star characters like Bennett, Jinchuo, Fischl, and Xiangling, and even Sucrose, were all extremely powerful, if not best in slots, in a lot of team comps since the beginning of the game. They even had their very own free-to-play meta team that included Jinchuo, Xiangling, Bennett, and then any other DPS that was also insanely powerful. Thing is, even though these characters were accessible and efficient, many people hated the fact that new characters weren't as good as them, even if it meant that everyone from tryhard wells to casual free-to-plays would have a way to beat the game. Some people would have still preferred for power creep rather than quote-unquote reverse power creep. This term and disapproval by the community started when the Dendro meta came out during the Sumeru patches. New characters like Sino were as good, if not worse, than characters like Keqing in aggravate teams, which frustrated a lot of people since Keqing is a standard 5-star character that has been out since the beginning of the game. Add in the fact that Hyper Bloom became the easiest and most powerful playstyle in the game that any Electro character with enough elemental mastery could take advantage of, and the reverse power creep term became solidified in the community. Characters like Raiden Shogun were better off running an elemental mastery build rather than her typical energy recharge playstyle, since even a Hyper Bloom Raiden could do more damage than a C2 Raiden played with an energy recharge build. Because of this, the difficulty of the game was trivialized and the HP of enemies were increased to accommodate that fact, since the Dendro meta was so powerful and accessible to all. What's even worse is that because of this, the majority of characters that people had summoned on, along with the new characters they were summoning on, were mostly mediocre in comparison to the Dendro meta, which many people argued didn't matter, for the Dendro meta was incredibly accessible to all players. So the question that they posed was, why would any player ever complain about not being able to clear endgame contents quickly and efficiently? I won't go into this small controversy any further, since power creep has long since evolved from this stage, and people to this day have mixed opinions about it. But I will say, as a Sino enjoyer, I definitely stand with the crowd that hated reverse power creep for making new characters suck and for increasing the difficulty of endgame content if you didn't want to play a boring playstyle such as Hyper Bloom. After this Dendro meta reverse power creep fiasco in the Sumeru patches, we got new Villette in Fontaine. New Villette single-handedly raised the power ceiling of the game by a substantial amount. The second he came out, the Dendro meta was shoved to the side and the HP of enemies was inflated to accommodate his insane DPS. To make matters worse, his best in slot teammate, Furina, was released right after, which increased the power ceiling even more because she synergized with his HP scaling requirements. Not only that, but she too was a Hydro character, which, when paired with new Villettes, it allowed new Villettes to receive even more HP from their Hydro Resonance teammate buff, thus allowing him to do even more damage. Furina herself also power crept pretty much every support and sub DPS in the game, with the likes of Fischl and Xiangling not being obliterated by her damage numbers, but still having a lower DPS than her. Even Jinchuo was power crept, since even though their DPS numbers are fairly competitive, Furina fills a support slot, which allows her to have another support on the team that can amplify the damage of the team. Not to mention that she doesn't need normal attacks to trigger her sub DPS, which matters a ton since Jinchuo can't do any sub DPS with new Villettes. For a while, new Villettes was the embodiment of power, with recently released characters like Risley, Linny, Navia, and Clorinde reaching mediocre numbers in comparison. Even with the release of Arlecchino, the fourth of the Fatui Harbingers, the Cinder of Two Worlds, simply became an alternative DPS that reached the numbers only relative to new Villettes. But this was actually a good thing, for even though these recent characters weren't as good as new Villettes and Furina combined, they were still better than the old characters enough to where it didn't feel like a new wave of absolute power creep, and it didn't make players feel like they had wasted their time and money summoning on a character that had already fallen off the meta before they were even given a chance. So So the majority of the player base was actually kinda fine with the newbie-led power creep, since even though he was the cause for another surge in HP inflation for the enemies, the majority of new characters were still able to beat the content. Not to mention that the Dendro meta was still pretty competitive, doing numbers on par with recent Fontaine characters, meaning that even though newbie-leds was absolutely broken, the HP inflation didn't actually accommodate for all of his DPS, only a part of it that was on par with the other newer characters. Luckily, Natlan helped with this increase in HP inflation because practically every new character being released was as good as newbie-leds. From Mualani to Kanich to Chaska, every new DPS was able to reach numbers on par if not better than newbie-leds, which means that now, as long as players summoned on a new Natlan unit, even supports were as good as the old supports like Furina or Chevrus, with Cylonen and Ayansan being as good if not better in certain niches than other supports like Kazuha and Bennett. However, it's a shame that this peace was short-lived, for once Mavuika released, everything went into chaos. Just kidding. Even though Mavuika was reaching numbers far higher than newbie-leds, it seems like because she was such an anomaly, the bosses were still being catered towards the majority of new characters, meaning that although she practically trivialized the endgame content, the majority of new characters were still able to clear since the HP inflation was catered towards them. But obviously, because every new character was hitting numbers on par with newbie-leds' power level, the HP of bosses was now accommodated to newer characters' level of power creep, which, if you remember, back in the Fontaine era, if this were to happen, practically every single character, even the new ones, would be unplayable. So, when you cut to the Natlan era, and now bosses have undergone HP inflation on par with newbie-led, this makes it so that Mavuika and every new Natlan character is viable, including newbie-leds. But now, every other character in the game, at least at C0 S0, is practically unplayable, unless you have their best teams, aka teams with brand new Natlan Powercreep supports, or with C6 4 stars. Not to mention, most bosses are now catered towards newer characters, with a lot of bosses being trivialized with new Natlan characters. Now, I will admit it'd be a bit disingenuous to say that a lot of these bosses have mechanics that completely made old characters unplayable. A lot of these character-specific mechanics can actually be circumvented with old characters if you just use a little bit of creativity in your team building. But I also believe that it'd be disingenuous to say that these mechanics don't carry even a sliver of blame for why old characters have slowly but surely become unusable. Regardless, I actually think there might be some hope with the brand new characters in the Natlan patches, like with Skirk, although her kit is extremely restrictive, making it so that unless you have 5-star Cryo and Hydro characters on her team, her damage will suck. This restriction, at least to me, shows that not only are they trying out the classic predatory practices of releasing new characters that are unplayable unless you summon on new and more powerful supports, which it seems they kinda tried with Silani and Mavuika but ultimately failed because of how powerful Mavuika is. But it also shows that they're trying to not break the power ceiling of Mavuika just yet, since Skirk, although powerful, still isn't as powerful as Mavuika. As of right now, it seems like the path the Genshin devs will take in terms of power creep will be similar to the path they've always taken, which is to release characters that are as strong if not stronger than the old region's strongest character, then release an insanely powerful character that will serve as the basis for the next region's power level, then repeat. So, if you consider Genshin Impact's reputation of minimal power creep relative to games like HSR to be fine and healthy, well then I guess there isn't much of a problem. But if you think that slowly but surely power creep of nation to nation is starting to become more evident to the point to where C0, S0, Eula, Albedo, Chao, Tartaglia, Klee, Ganyu, Hutao, Raiden, Ito, Sino, and Yoimiya, along with practically every 4-star, aren't even viable, well then yes, power creep is finally happening in Genshin Impact. To make matters worse, they recently introduced a new endgame called Stygian Onslaught, which again is what inspired me to make this video. Stygian Onslaught does offer players primo rewards that are pretty easy to obtain, but the other rewards, those being the 4-star and 5-star weapon cosmetics, are without a doubt locked behind a paywall, with the 5-star cosmetics requiring requiring an even more ridiculous amounts of horizontal and vertical investments than the 4-star ones, which are already insanely hard to get. Not only that, but even if you were to theoretically fall into the FOMO trap and summon on new meta characters, their constellations, their signatures, and refinements, just so that you can beat that game mode, you'd only be able to reap the rewards of spending your hard-earned money for barely a month. After that, if your meta characters fall off and you're not able to clear the new round of bosses, that means that you just wasted your precious time and money that you can't get back. Regardless, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.